At 22 years old, Sarah Whittaker didn't exactly look like someone who belonged on a military base, let alone one as unforgiving as Cold Ridge Station, perched on the icy edge of Alaska. With her chestnut hair braided neatly into twin tails and an oversized jacket that hung off her petite frame like a borrowed coat, she looked more like a lost college student than anyone of consequence, which, in the eyes of most stationed there, she was. Her official title was Intern Flight Operations Program, part of a senior year placement from a Midwestern university. But in reality, Sarah's role was little more than background noise, typing up reports, cleaning flight consoles, making coffee. A sort of glorified assistant no one took seriously. Some of the more seasoned personnel didn't even bother learning her name. They just called her Badge Girl, a nod to the ever-present student ID clipped to her coat pocket. One pilot joked that she was like the base's mascot, always around, never in the way, but certainly not meant to be taken seriously. To them, she was harmless. To Sarah, it was humiliating. Cold Ridge was no place for dreamers, and certainly not for civilian interns. The base sat beneath a ceiling of gray sky and wind that screamed through steel hangars like a warning. Most people there were veterans with hard eyes and harder reputations. Sarah knew she didn't look like them, sound like them, or carry the same scars. But what they didn't know, couldn't know, was what she did after everyone else clocked out. The base's flight simulation room, intended for pilot training exercises, locked up tight by day. But after midnight, Sarah had discovered something few cared about. The backup access panel didn't require officer clearance, only a technician code. One she had memorized within a week. While others slept, Sarah trained. Alone in the dim blue glow of the simulator screens, she flew through blizzards and battled mechanical failures that would have rattled combat-hardened pilots. It wasn't part of her coursework. No one had assigned her the emergency protocols. But Sarah dug into the archives anyway, pulling scenarios from the Advanced Contingency Simulation Library, a dusty database most officers hadn't touched in years. She didn't just practice. She rehearsed survival, over and over again, until each key command became muscle memory. Other interns thought she was wasting her time. "This isn't the academy, Sarah," one said. "We're here to observe, not fly missions." But Sarah had never been one to sit quietly on the sidelines. Something about the danger of it, the challenge, made her come alive. The only person who ever noticed was Master Sergeant Jim Walker, a quiet man in his late 40s with 3 combat tours under his belt. Walker rarely spoke unless necessary. But every so often, in the early hours of the morning, he would walk by the simulator room and glance inside. He never interrupted, never offered advice, but there was something in his eyes, a kind of silent calculation, that hinted he saw more than the rest. Still, to the rest of the base, Sarah remained invisible, or worse, ornamental. They joked she brewed better coffee than any junior officer. They mocked the way she wore her headset like a real controller. And when she occasionally offered suggestions during morning briefings, she was met with polite dismissal or condescending smiles. "Flying a simulator isn't real flying," one of the pilots told her. "Out there, when lives are on the line, you don't get do-overs." Sarah didn't argue. She just nodded, smiled, and went back to wiping down their equipment. But deep inside, she held on to something they couldn't take from her: preparation. Sarah wasn't just role-playing scenarios. She was preparing for something they hadn't even imagined yet, something that would arrive, unannounced and unforgiving, one icy morning. And when it did, the girl they called Badge Girl would be the only one who knew exactly what to do. By day, Sarah Whittaker brewed coffee, fetched printouts, and wiped down flight consoles with the quiet efficiency expected of an intern no one believed in. But by night, when the winds howled outside the steel walls of Cold Ridge Station and the world turned gray with sleep, she stepped into another life entirely. At exactly 12:03 a.m., the corridor lights would dim for scheduled power rotation, and the motion sensors in the West Wing would stop pinging. That was Sarah's cue. She moved silently, her steps memorized like choreography. No flashlight, no sound, just her badge, her breath, and the soft hum of the flight simulation room that had long since been forgotten by most of the active duty personnel. The keypad at the door was primitive, older than most of the aircraft parked in Hangar 2, with the right sequence of maintenance codes. Copied discreetly from a clipboard no one had bothered to secure. The lock clicked open. Inside, the room flickered to life. Sim units hummed. Monitors lit up. The cold blue glow washed over her face like a second sunrise. Here, Sarah wasn't the intern. She was the pilot. And she didn't just practice takeoffs and landings. She chose chaos. Engine failures at 8,000 feet. Hydraulic loss in sub-zero turbulence. Icing on control surfaces during descent. Complete electrical blackout during final approach. These were the simulations no one voluntarily touched. Not even the junior officers in training. But for Sarah, they were nightly rituals. Her fingers moved with clinical speed across the virtual cockpit, inputting emergency commands, flipping through redundant systems, and rerouting flight paths in real time. She crashed often at first, but she learned. Her notebooks, tucked beneath her bunk and labeled only with weather codes, were filled with revised procedures, terrain maps, and alternate landing vectors. By the third month, she wasn't just surviving the simulations. She was mastering them. No one knew. At least, almost no one. There was one man who noticed. He never said anything, never knocked. But Master Sergeant Jim Walker, the base's grizzled logistics lead and former combat flight engineer, had eyes sharper than the northern wind. Most nights, just before dawn, Walker made rounds through the West Corridor. Officially, it was to check supply levels. Unofficially, he was a creature of habit, one whose instincts had kept him alive through 3 tours overseas. He noticed the lights in the sim room flicking off at odd hours. The air still warm when it shouldn't be. Once, he even found a flight log left open, with annotations too detailed, too precise, to be from any casual trainee. So the next night he paused outside the door. Through the observation window he saw her. The college intern, hair tied back, brow furrowed in laser focus, her small hands gliding over the controls like she'd been born to them. And she wasn't playing. She was flying like lives depended on it. Walker didn't interrupt. He stood there for 5 minutes, arms crossed, unreadable expression, before walking away without a sound. The next morning, Sarah found a flight manual sitting on her desk. No note, no signature, just one tabbed page in red ink: emergency low, visibility evac procedures, River Valley protocols. From that day forward, she found more subtle signs that someone knew. The simulator's maintenance logs began resetting at 400 a.m., erasing her digital footprints. The door code remained unchanged, even when other systems were upgraded. And once, after a particularly brutal weather sim, she found a hot thermos of black coffee sitting on the console. Master Sergeant Walker never said a word, but his quiet support spoke volumes. To the rest of Cold Ridge, Sarah was still just badge girl, the intern who filed reports and asked too many questions. But in the simulation room, between midnight and dawn, she was a different version of herself, sharp, decisive, and utterly unafraid of failure. What none of them understood was this: Sarah wasn't waiting for permission. She was preparing for inevitability. And in less than a week, that inevitability would arrive, in the form of a failing medevac helicopter, 4 dying soldiers, and a sky too violent for even the best trained pilots. But not for her. She had already flown that storm, hundreds of times, alone, in the dark, and she would be ready. The cold at Cold Ridge Station was biting that morning, a kind of sharp, metallic chill that sank straight into the bone. Visibility was low. Winds lashed against the glass panels of the control tower, and most of the staff were still stirring their first cup of coffee when the klaxon broke through the stillness. "Medical emergency inbound! F-18 Delta is declaring engine failure!" The control room, once quiet with routine, erupted into a coordinated storm of panic. Red strobes flashed, monitors flickered, radios crackled with stress-laced voices. "Control, this is F-18 Delta. Engine 2 is down. We've lost altitude control. Repeat, Engine 2 is non-responsive. We're coming in fast." Every eye turned toward the radar screen. The helicopter was marked with a pulsing icon, dropping altitude too quickly, wobbling erratically in the high crosswinds. 4 lives were aboard, all critically injured soldiers being medevaced from a forward outpost. Their only chance was a safe landing at Cold Ridge, but the odds were grim. Flight techs scrambled to adjust telemetry. Controllers began feeding in corrective vectors. But every scenario run on the sim panels came back with the same grim result: fatal crash on impact. Too steep, too fast, too unstable. There was no safe way in. Not in that wind, not in that descent path. And in the corner of the room, half forgotten as usual, stood Sarah Whittaker, still wearing her oversized fleece jacket, her student ID flapping slightly from her pocket. She stared unblinking at the trajectory data on screen 4. Her lips moved slightly, silently counting seconds between wind gusts, between tilt corrections. She knew this pattern. She had flown this before. Not in the real world, but in the silent blue glow of the simulator room. Scenario A20: dual rotor descent failure in Arctic crosswinds, limited visibility, medical evac configuration. She had trained for this dozens of times. Without thinking, her voice broke into the radio chatter. Recommend vector change to approach Gamma 7. Reduce airspeed to 60 knots. Deploy emergency flaps at 400 feet. Maintain glide until negative descent resolves. The room stilled for half a second. Then a voice cut across her like a blade. Who said that? It was Captain Thomas Reardon, the duty officer on shift. Silver-haired, stern, a veteran of 2 theaters, and a man who did not appreciate being interrupted, especially not by an intern. He turned, eyes blazing. Miss Whittaker, this is a live emergency. You are not authorized to speak, let alone. But she didn't back down. Her eyes stayed locked on the screen, her voice calm and clear. Sir, that flight path leads to full tailspin within 30 seconds. I've run that sequence. There's a solution. You are a student, not a controller. This is not a simulator, young lady. That should have been the end of it. But it wasn't. Master Sergeant Jim Walker, who had been silent in the back of the room, took one step forward. And then he said the words that shifted the course of the morning. Let her try. Reardon whipped around. Are you serious? Walker's voice was low, gravelly. She's not certified to fail either. But right now, unless someone does something different, 4 men are going to die. Another second passed, another blip on the radar, and then Reardon growled, Well, have your rank if this goes wrong, Sergeant. Walker didn't respond. He just looked at Sarah, nodded once. She didn't hesitate. Sarah lunged toward the secondary console, fingers flying across the keypad. Her hands moved faster than the watching officers could follow, toggling emergency override codes, inputting the vectors she knew by heart. The room filled with data streams as the new projector fed directly into the helicopter's nav system. Control, this is F-18 Delta. The pilot's voice crackled. Receiving updated flight path, adjusting silence. 5 seconds. 10. Then, out the window, the black shape of the helicopter crested into view. It was off-kilter, shaking, fighting to stay upright. But it was following the new path lower, slower, riding the glide vector with surgical precision. At the final moment, it dipped, bounced hard on the landing pad, and held. Touchdown, the rotors spun out. The tail settled. The aircraft was down, alive, all 4 of them. No one moved. The only sound in the room was the hum of electronics and the faint tremble in Sarah's breath as her hands hovered over the keys. Then the pilot's voice came through, thick with disbelief. Control, Delta here. We're down. We're safe. Don't know how that worked, but whoever ran that vector, thank you. A long pause. And then every head in the room turned toward the girl with the student badge and trembling hands. Sarah looked up slowly. It was just standard emergency procedure, she said, voice barely above a whisper. Scenario A2. I've practiced it, maybe 100 times. Captain Reardon stared at her like he was seeing her for the first time. 100. She nodded. Every night after my shift. In that moment, everything changed. She was no longer badge girl. Not in their eyes. And not in the mirror. What she had done wasn't luck. It was preparation. And it had just saved 4 lives. Just hours after the emergency landing, Cold Ridge Station was quiet once again. But it wasn't peace. It was dread. The F-18 Delta sat motionless on the pad, frost forming around the landing gear as the engines cooled. Inside the base infirmary, 4 soldiers lay unconscious, each strapped to gurneys and hooked up to makeshift monitors that beeped far too slowly. The medic's face was pale as he reviewed their vitals, and then he said the words that slammed through the room like a hammer. 2 of them won't make it through the night. Not without surgical care. We need to get them to a proper hospital. The nearest full-equipped facility was Delta Regional Medical, 260 miles south. Normally, that was a straightforward medevac run, but nothing was normal that day. Outside, the sky was already bruising purple, and the air smelled of frozen metal. A blizzard warning had been issued, the kind of storm you don't fly into, not at any altitude, not with any aircraft. The weather radar confirmed it a Category 4 Arctic front, descending fast and hard. Whiteout conditions, 60-mile-per-hour winds, near zero visibility. Within the next hour, the base would be completely locked in for at least 3 days. Every pilot in the war room stared at the charts in grim silence. "We're not flying in that," said Lieutenant Colonel Rick Hayes, the most experienced pilot on base. He had over 3,000 logged flight hours and a chest full of ribbons. But right now, he shook his head without hesitation. Not at night. Not with those patients. That's suicide. Another pilot tried suggesting the northern route. Maybe they could outrun the storm. But the weather team shot that down quickly. It's covering everything from here to the Canadian border. There's nowhere to hide. No top cover. No window. Everyone in the room reached the same conclusion: it's impossible. Everyone except one. In the back corner, still clutching her flight notebook, Sarah Whittaker wasn't looking at the weather charts. She was staring at the topographical maps, zoomed in on terrain, altitudes, ridge breaks, river valleys. Then she pulled up a secondary interface and began running fuel burn rates at various altitudes. Her stylus tapped against the screen like a metronome. Her brow was furrowed, not in fear, but in calculation. She spoke quietly, but the room heard her anyway. "What if we don't fly above the storm?" Heads turned, some with curiosity, most with annoyance. Sarah continued, voice steadier now. "What if we go under it, low altitude along the river valley? The terrain provides natural wind shielding, and the navigation beacons are still operational every 5 kilometers. We'd be flying IFR, fully on instruments." Captain Reardon scoffed from across the room. "Miss Whittaker, we appreciate your earlier help, but this is a combat-grade storm. You're talking about flying blind through mountain passes in a blizzard." "I'm talking about a controlled route," she replied. "I've studied this. The valley walls create consistent downdraft patterns. We can use them to stabilize. The beacons give us line guidance. If we maintain 200 feet AGL and throttle down to 180 knots, we can stay inside the corridor. It's narrow, but it's flyable." The room went still. It wasn't the absurdity of her proposal that quieted them. It was the confidence in her voice. Master Sergeant Walker leaned forward. "What airframe?" Sarah didn't miss a beat. "Same bird. The F-18 Delta. It's already configured for medevac, and it has the best terrain mapping radar and weather tracking on base." Reardon raised an eyebrow. "And who's going to fly it?" Hayes already said no. So did Jennings. "The rest are grounded or out of hours." "What are you suggesting? That you fly it?" The silence after that was thicker than the snow outside. Sarah didn't blink. "Yes?" The laugh that came from Reardon wasn't cruel. It was just baffled. "You've never piloted an aircraft in your life. You're not even licensed." "No, sir," Sarah said. "But I've flown this route in simulation more times than anyone here has flown it in real life. I designed a custom nav loop based on beacon drift. I've practiced every vector, every altitude, every emergency correction." Walker looked at her, not with skepticism, but with understanding. "And you really believe this can work?" "I wouldn't be speaking if I didn't," she said softly. "But we don't have much time." The medic stepped in from the hall, still wearing blood-specked gloves. "Whatever you're deciding, you need to decide now. One of them's crashing. We're not going to get a second chance." There was no more debate. Walker turned to the crew chief. "Prep the F-18. Full med kit loadout. Strip it down to minimum weight." "Roger." He turned to Sarah. "You've got 20 minutes to suit up." As the others moved to coordinate, Reardon stepped in front of her one last time. "You're trying to do something no one else here is willing to try. You understand the consequences, don't you?" "I do," she said. "But they'll die if no one goes." And that was the only answer she needed to give. In the hangar, snow was already drifting past the landing lights, and the wind screamed like something alive. But inside the cockpit of the F-18, Sarah Whittaker ran her Flight like she'd done 100 times before. Only now it wasn't a simulation. Now, the lives she was trying to save weren't theoretical. They were breathing behind her, and the storm wasn't coming. It was already here. The storm was closing in. Out on the tarmac, the snow had started to swirl in thick, angry spirals, and the temperature had dropped 20 degrees in less than an hour. Inside the operations briefing room, the energy had shifted. What had started as a crisis was now something else, a countdown. The 4 injured soldiers, already stabilized, were strapped into the back of the F-18 Delta, which now sat fully fueled and reconfigured for emergency medevac. The engines were on standby. The ground crew had done their part, but the seat up front, the pilot's seat, remained empty. All eyes were on the room's ranking officers, but none of the senior aviators had moved. Not one of them had stepped forward. Not even the legendary Lieutenant Colonel Hayes, who now stared down at the floor with clenched fists and regret in his eyes. The silence was sharp, until Sarah Whittaker broke it. "I'll fly it." At first, no one responded. It was as if the sentence hadn't registered. But when it did, the reaction was immediate and visceral. A mix of laughter, disbelief, and outrage. "What did you say?" Captain Reardon asked, his voice low and hard. Sarah didn't flinch. "I said I'll fly the mission. The F-18's ready, and we don't have time to wait for someone else." "This isn't a debate club, Miss Whittaker," another officer snapped. "You're a civilian intern. You've never even been inside a cockpit at altitude. You have no license, no certification." "I know," she interrupted, calmly. "But none of that changes what's in front of us." Reardon shook his head. "You don't understand the risks. Flying in that storm, through mountain valleys, with 4 lives in the back. That's not just dangerous. That's almost guaranteed fatal." Sarah stepped forward, her voice steady and clear. "I've flown that route in simulation over 100 times. I mapped the beacons myself. I've logged more simulated hours in those conditions than any pilot here. I know the terrain. I know the patterns. I know that aircraft inside and out." "You've flown a simulation," Hayes said gently but firmly. "But real life doesn't come with reset buttons." "No," she said, "but real life also doesn't give us another option. Those men will die if we don't act." It was then that Master Sergeant Jim Walker stood up from the back of the room. "Let her go," he said. The statement landed like a brick in water, heavy and impossible to ignore. "Sergeant," Reardon said slowly, "you can't be serious." Walker's voice was gravel and steel, dead serious. "I've been watching her for months. She's not guessing. She's not pretending. She's prepared more than most I've seen. You're endorsing this. A civilian, a college girl. She's the only one who isn't afraid of the damn storm," Walker said. "And right now, she's the only one willing to take the risk." Reardon looked at Sarah again. She met his gaze without blinking. "You're telling me you're ready to sit in that cockpit," he said slowly, "and carry 4 wounded soldiers through the worst blizzard this base has seen in years, knowing full well that if anything goes wrong, you won't make it out." Sarah took a breath. "I'm not ready because I've flown the most hours. I'm ready because I've trained for this exact scenario, again and again, and because nobody else is stepping forward." For a long moment, the room was still. And then Reardon nodded, once. It wasn't approval, it was acceptance. The kind men in uniform give when they know the odds are bad, but the alternatives are worse. "Swit her up," he said to the crew chief. "Copy that." As the room burst into motion, Walker approached Sarah and handed her a flight helmet. "It's old," he said, "but it's yours now." Sarah looked down at the scratched visor. There was a name etched faintly on the inside. Someone who had flown before her, who had faced their own impossible mission, and now it was her turn. In the locker room, the gear didn't quite fit. The flight suit was too long in the sleeves, the boots half a size too big. But none of it mattered. As she zipped up the suit and pulled on her gloves, her hands were shaking, but her eyes, reflected in the steel mirror, were calm. Outside, the winds howled louder. The storm had begun its siege. But in her mind, Sarah was already flying. Every beacon, every ridge, every throttle adjustment, every warning light. She saw them all in sequence, like a silent movie she'd watched 100 times before. And as she stepped onto the tarmac, helmet in hand, she wasn't just an intern anymore. She was the only pilot willing to go. The only one who believed she could bring them home. The hangar doors creaked open, groaning against the wind as if reluctant to let her go. Sarah Whittaker, suited head to toe in borrowed flight gear, climbed the metal steps into the cockpit of the F-18 Delta. The cabin smelled like cold steel and worn leather. Behind her, the 4 injured soldiers lay strapped and sedated in the modified medevac bay, unaware that their lives now rested in the hands of someone the base hadn't even let pour coffee for the flight officers a week ago. She sat down, adjusted the harness, and stared at the instrument panel. Dozens of lights blinked. Warnings flashed red and amber. Navigation overlays pulsed with storm data. Fast-moving squall lines, air pressure shifts, gale, force crosswinds. It would have terrified most pilots, but not her, because this was exactly what she had trained for. Sarah ran through the pre-flight checklist with calm, practiced precision. Each switch flipped like second nature. Each sequence came not from guesswork, but from hundreds of hours in the simulator, silent, lonely hours while the rest of the base slept. Now, those hours were about to matter more than anything else she had ever done. Cold Ridge Control, this is F-18 Delta, requesting clearance for emergency medevac departure. Her voice, through the headset, was steady. On the other end of the line, the tower hesitated. Then came the reply, Delta, you are cleared for takeoff. You've got a 12-minute window before whiteout. Godspeed. The engines roared to life. Snow ripped across the runway like shredded glass, swirling in violent streaks. The moment the wheels left the ground, the base disappeared into the blizzard behind her. She was alone in the white, altitude 200 feet, speed 175 knots, beacon locked, valley corridor engaged. The turbulence hit instantly, like being thrown into a washing machine. The F-18 bucked and twisted, groaning under the pressure. Most pilots would have fought the controls, overcorrected, or panicked. Sarah didn't. Her hands made micro-adjustments, subtle but constant, guided entirely by instruments and sheer instinct born of repetition. Altimeter readings flickered. Crosswinds punched at the fuselage. One sudden downdraft almost clipped the tree line. She didn't blink. 30 minutes in, contact with base radar was lost. The storm had swallowed her signal. Any lesser pilot would have turned back, or worse, flown blind. But Sarah switched to emergency navigation protocols. Settings buried deep in the system, rarely used, often misunderstood, and almost never tested in live operations. She accessed them without hesitation. Topographical radar overlay enabled. Beacon triangulation manual sync. Fuel management rerouted to emergency flow. Every single function she had rehearsed dozens of times. In simulation, she had even practiced flying blind with a total comms blackout, just in case. Now it wasn't just theory. Now it was survival. At the 90-minute mark, ice buildup began forming on the wings. The de-icing system was struggling under the load. Sarah throttled down to conserve power, adjusted the airflow to divert heat back to the wing roots, and tapped into a bypass circuit most pilots didn't even know existed. It worked. The ice began to melt, and the F-18 kept flying. For 2 hours, she flew through a storm that would have grounded warbirds and combat transports alike. Ducking between sheer cliffs and snow-laced trees, hugging the terrain so low that even satellite tracking would have missed her. She flew entirely on instrument logic and pre-mapped vector memory. She flew because she knew there was no one else coming, and finally, through the white haze and the storm-smeared glass, she saw a blinking set of approach beacons. Delta Base. She brought the nose level, began her final descent. The wind was violent, cross-cutting at nearly 40 miles an hour. Any miscalculation, and the aircraft would spiral into the snow-covered tarmac, but her fingers were still steady. Landing gear deployed, throttle adjusted to 40%, flaps full. She felt the wheels touch down, hard but controlled, and then bounce once. And then silence. The aircraft settled. The engines wound down. The storm still howled, but inside that cockpit, everything was still. The med team was already rushing out in thermal gear, unloading the stretchers, barking commands. But Sarah didn't move. Her hands were still gripping the controls, and her chest rose and fell in slow, exhausted waves. It was over. She had made it. All 4 soldiers were alive. Inside the Delta Base tower, The crew had been listening to her signal the entire flight. The last 15 minutes, no one had spoken. No one had breathed. And when the touchdown was confirmed, the room erupted, not in cheers, but in stunned silence. Because what they had just witnessed wasn't luck. It was a miracle made of muscle memory, steel nerves, and a young woman's refusal to be ordinary. Sarah Whittaker climbed down from the cockpit an hour later, her face pale, her flight suit soaked in sweat, her hands still shaking from the adrenaline. But in her eyes, there was clarity. She had faced the storm, alone, without a license, without formal authority, and she had flown them through hell and brought them home. The storm continued to rage outside Delta Base, but inside the command center, the atmosphere had shifted. Word of the impossible flight, a civilian intern piloting a fully loaded military medevac aircraft through zero visibility conditions, had spread like wildfire across the airwaves. And within 4 hours, the call came from Washington. The Department of Defense was launching a full investigation. Not because of the outcome. All 4 wounded soldiers were alive, stabilized, and receiving care, but because of the circumstances, a civilian, no military flight certification, no formal clearance. And yet, she had taken command of one of the Air Force's most advanced platforms in a live emergency. It was a breach of a dozen regulations, maybe more. Back at Cold Ridge Station, the atmosphere turned tense again. Commanders scrambled to prepare documentation. Witness statements were gathered. The flight data recorder, or black box, from the F-18 Delta was pulled for immediate analysis. Sarah Whittaker, now grounded and under temporary supervision, sat alone in a small debriefing room. Still in her sweat-soaked flight suit, her hair matted from the helmet, she looked less like a hero and more like what the paperwork said she was. A 22-year-old college student on an internship. No one told her what the consequences might be, but she knew enough to understand this could ruin everything. Back in Washington, General Patricia Morrison, a 30-year veteran who had overseen combat air operations in Iraq, Afghanistan, and the Arctic Defense Initiative, was handed the preliminary report. She didn't speak for a long while as she scrolled through the flight logs, timestamps, maneuver records, altitude corrections, fuel adjustments. At first, it seemed unreal, almost too perfect. But the black box data didn't lie. Every decision Sarah had made, from the moment she initiated the takeoff sequence to the second her wheels touched down, had been textbook. No, better than textbook. The final line in the report summary said it all: flight path execution 98.6% optimal. Instrument handling exemplary. Emergency protocols initiated correctly, with procedural creativity under duress. Recommendation: flight was executed with a level of precision consistent with top 5% of active duty pilots. Morrison put the tablet down, leaned back, and looked at her senior advisors. "I've seen combat pilots make worse decisions," she said bluntly, in conditions far less dangerous than what she faced. No one in the room argued, because they all knew, in any other circumstance, this would have been a disaster. And yet here they were, looking at a mission that had defied all logic and protocol, and succeeded. The official inquiry lasted 2 days. Sarah was asked everything, from why she entered the simulator after hours to how she knew about rarely used emergency beacon protocols. She answered with quiet clarity. No excuses. No dramatics. "I trained for that route," she told the panel. "I didn't expect to fly it for real. But when it became clear no one else would, I knew I had to try." Some on the board frowned at her lack of formal authorization. Others just listened, unable to ignore what the data had already confirmed. When the verdict came, it surprised everyone. The Department of Defense concluded that Sarah Whittaker had acted appropriately under extreme emergency conditions. Her decision to fly had been unorthodox, yes, but justified by the immediate and life-threatening nature of the situation. And more importantly, her actions revealed a critical shortcoming in emergency response training and simulation integration, a gap that must now be addressed at the institutional level. In other words, Sarah hadn't just saved lives, she had exposed a blind spot in the military's own systems. Later that week, in a closed-door session at Cold Ridge, General Morrison herself flew out to meet Sarah. She didn't arrive with press. No awards. No cameras, just a single personal conversation. "I don't care what patch you wear," Morrison said to her. You knew what to do when no one else did. That matters. And it's time the system learned how to recognize that kind of readiness, no matter where it comes from. Before leaving, Morrison placed a small, sealed envelope in Sarah's hand. Inside was a formal commendation signed by the Secretary of Defense, not just acknowledging Sarah's actions, but recommending her for direct entry into the Air Force's accelerated pilot training pipeline. Back at the base, things changed. Officers who had once laughed behind closed doors now stood when she entered a room. The simulator she used to sneak into was officially added to the night shift roster, now designated for advanced emergency procedure drills taught by Sarah Whitaker. But perhaps the most meaningful gesture came quietly. In the hall just outside the main control tower, a single photograph was mounted. It showed the F-18 Delta, its nose dusted in frost, landing gear locked down, and Sarah climbing down the ladder, helmet under one arm, eyes tired but steady. Beneath it, a plaque read, "Preparedness isn't always about rank. Sometimes, the right person just gets there first." And for the first time since arriving at Cold Ridge, Sarah walked those halls not as badge girl, but as the pilot who flew through hell and made it back. In the days that followed the investigation, the snow at Cold Ridge Station began to soften, melting into thin streams that trickled beneath the runways and down into the valley. But the shift inside the base was far more profound than a change in weather. People moved differently when Sarah Whitaker walked by now. The same officers who once ignored her in the mess hall now greeted her with a quiet nod. The same flight crews who had barely looked up when she brewed their coffee now stood when she entered the room. The silence that had once come from dismissal had been replaced by something heavier and far more meaningful: respect. And it wasn't just local. The Department of Defense had made their decision public. Sarah's actions had not only saved 4 American lives, they had highlighted blind spots in current emergency response doctrine and simulation integration, flaws that would now be addressed across multiple commands. In the official release, she was referred to not as the intern, but by a new title: Civilian Aviator in Command, Emergency Flight 97A F-18 Delta. A week later, a black government SUV pulled onto the base during a morning snowfall. Inside was a representative from the Accelerated Officer Flight Program, hand-delivering a letter. Inside that letter was an offer. Sarah had been formally accepted into the Air Force's Elite Pilot Training Initiative, a program typically reserved for top academy graduates, fast-track officers, and combat veterans. She wouldn't just be allowed to train. She would be starting with advanced standing. And at the very top of the paperwork, in red block letters, was one word: approved. But honors and programs weren't what mattered to Sarah. What she remembered most was the morning the photo was unveiled. It was simple. Quiet, no ceremony, no speeches. Just a few dozen crewmen, base staff, and flight officers gathered at the long corridor just outside the command tower. A hallway lined with portraits of pilots who had served through Arctic campaigns, storm recoveries, and black flag emergencies. The photo had been taken minutes after she had landed the F-18 through the blizzard. Her helmet was tucked beneath her arm. Her flight suit was wrinkled and streaked with ice, and her face, not smiling, not triumphant, held a look of quiet resolve. As if she wasn't celebrating anything. As if she had simply done what needed to be done. Underneath the image, the brass plate read, "Sarah Whitaker, Pilot Flight 97A. When no one else would fly, she did." Some of the crew clapped. Others just stood still, hats in hand. But it was Master Sergeant Jim Walker who spoke the only words anyone would remember that day. He looked at the photo, then turned to the group and said, "This wasn't luck. This was discipline meeting a moment, and she was the only one ready." By the end of the month, Sarah had officially graduated from intern to flight operations instructor. She began training new pilots, military and civilian alike, in advanced emergency scenarios, including the very same corridor flight she'd flown through the storm. She didn't need a call sign. She didn't need a uniform full of medals. Her story had become something larger. A quiet reminder on every base where someone felt overlooked, underestimated, or forgotten, because Sarah Whitaker had walked into Cold Ridge as just a college girl, and she had walked out a pilot, an instructor, and a symbol, not of rebellion, but of preparation, clarity, and courage. Her legacy was not loud. It wasn't written in heroics or broadcast across national television. It was written in one perfect flight, carved into the snow and remembered by those who knew what it meant to face the worst conditions imaginable and fly anyway. In a world that measures worth by rank, hours, and credentials, Sarah reminded them that none of those things matter when the storm is closing in and lives are on the line. All that matters then is who knows what to do and who's willing to step forward. Weeks after the snow had melted from the runways at Cold Ridge Station, and the base returned to its steady rhythm of drills and dispatches, Sarah Whittaker's story was still being whispered in the corners, in simulator rooms, at mess hall tables, and during late, night shift changes when young airmen traded stories about what happened that night. It wasn't just the flight anymore. It was what the flight meant. 4 men had lived because one young woman, considered by most to be just a tag-along intern, refused to accept the word impossible. And she hadn't done it with bravado, or blind luck, or reckless courage. She had done it with something much rarer, preparation. Not the kind that's awarded in ribbons or signed off in thick binders. This was the quiet kind, the kind no one sees. The kind that happens in the early hours of the morning, when everyone else is asleep. The kind that doesn't wait for permission or recognition. Because Sarah had never been preparing for attention. She had been preparing for a moment. She just didn't know when it would come. And when it did, no rank or title could have stopped her. Not because she demanded respect, but because, when chaos erupted and every calculation pointed to disaster, hers was the only voice that knew what to do. For many at the base, it was a humbling lesson. They had looked at Sarah and seen what they wanted to see: youth inexperience, someone not ready, someone who didn't belong, someone to dismiss. But her story became a caution to every officer who had ever rolled their eyes at the eager, the quiet, the unknown. Because sometimes the person you least expect, the one without stripes, without status, turns out to be the only one prepared when it counts. General Patricia Morrison would later write in a private memo to the Joint Chiefs, it was not her experience that saved those men. It was not her age or her title or her clearance level. It was her mastery of the systems, her calm under fire, her readiness. We have to start recognizing that. And slowly the culture began to shift. New simulation protocols were introduced across multiple bases, modeled after Sarah's nightly routines. Emergency response evaluations began factoring in scenario fluency, not just flight hours. And at Cold Ridge, cadets were now taught one rule above all: don't underestimate the quiet ones. They might be the only reason we make it home. But perhaps the greatest impact of Sarah's story was personal, found not in policy but in people. A young female trainee, newly arrived from Colorado, stood before the same simulator Sarah once used in secret. She looked at the screen, her fingers hesitant. Then she glanced at the photograph on the wall, the one of Sarah descending from the F-18. She took a breath, sat down, and started practicing. Because now, no one rolled their eyes at a college student in flight gear. Now they paid attention. Sarah, for her part, never sought the spotlight. She declined press interviews. She turned down book offers. She simply reported to training each morning, taught her emergency protocol class in the afternoon, and flew whenever she was asked. But when one of her students, a nervous young man fresh from basic, asked her what made her decide to fly that night, she gave an answer he never forgot. It wasn't a decision. It was the next step. I had already taken the first 1,000 before it. In a world that often confuses noise with leadership, Sarah Whittaker's story reminds us that preparation is its own kind of power, one that doesn't need to shout to be heard. Because sometimes when everyone else is too afraid, too frozen, or too proud to act, but it's the quietest voice in the room that changes everything. And in that voice, we find the kind of courage we didn't even know we were waiting for. Sometimes in life, we're told to wait our turn, to keep quiet, to stay in our lane. And maybe, like Sarah Whittaker, you've been made to feel like your voice doesn't count, that you're too young, too old, too inexperienced, or too invisible to make a difference. But here's the truth her story teaches us: you don't need a title to be ready. You don't need permission to be prepared. When the moment comes, it won't ask for your resume. It'll ask for your courage. Sarah wasn't the most senior. She wasn't even a certified pilot. But she had something no one else in that room did. She had done the work before anyone noticed. And when lives were on the line, that quiet preparation became the one thing that saved them. In a world that celebrates loud voices and big titles, let us remember this: the most important preparation often happens in silence. The right moment doesn't always knock. Sometimes it crashes through a blizzard. And when it does, your value won't be measured by what people called you, but by what you were ready to do. So if you've ever felt overlooked, underestimated, or ignored, don't stop. Keep learning, keep preparing, keep showing up. Because your moment may be closer than you think. Has there ever been a time when you were the only one who stepped up, even when no one believed in you? We'd love to hear your story in the comments below. And if these quiet, powerful stories resonate with you, subscribe to our channel. Because sometimes the voices that the world tries to silence are the very ones we need to hear most.